The federal government has tabled legislation to amend the Citizenship Act, and it has big implications for families where the parents are Canadians born abroad. If the bill passes, they could now be able to pass down citizenship rights to their children who were also born outside of Canada. Under a previous Conservative government, some of those children lost the right to citizenship in a move later declared unconstitutional. They've been called lost Canadians.
It is truly a moment for my family. Despite being status, my boys got a rejection letter from Citizenship and Immigration that they were not considered Canadian citizens. And I would rightfully say not only are they not lost Canadians, but quite the Canadians. You will see them at the next citizenship event and waving and saying that they are proud and rightful citizens.
Marc Miller is the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. Minister, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me on, David.
This Ontario Superior Court decision you're reacting to here, it came down in December. It gave you until June 19th to fix this. With the way things are moving through Parliament, are you going to hit that deadline?
Well, we certainly hope so. The reason we're introducing it is because we had a Senate private bill that had been stalled. We had had good work with all parties, but the Conservatives have played some party shenanigans in driving it down in the order list. So we decided to take matters responsibly in our own hands and present a government bill. That may seem like procedural complexities, but it's very important for purposes of answering a court case which was about fairness to Canadians who are entitled to citizenship. So ideally we would get it approved at all stages. It copies the Senate private bill that has had a lot of input from all parties. But again, this is something that we don't control as the government, but we're just eager to get it through. Obviously, we'll have to approach the court and say we're showing good efforts. At times, courts have been able to extend their judgments. In the meantime, I do have discretion to take a number of measures that allows me to grant citizenship, but that shouldn't be the way we do things.
Okay, but the Senate bill, the private member's bill aside, this was an order given to the government, and here it is May 23rd. So I just wonder why it took to this long to get to this point in the process from your end.
Yeah, look, fair question. I mean, we had high hopes that we would get the Senate private bill 245 into play, and that seems to have stalled. So this was a measure that we have been working on in an expedited fashion to get through and to present in front of Parliament. Ideally, again, we could get it approved at all stages. We will obviously, out of respect to the court, approach the court and show them the good efforts of the Government of Canada. But again, I see no reason to stall this because this is a court case which is about the fairness to Canadians respecting a charter right.
Right, so we saw Jenny Kwan with you today, and obviously the New Democrats are supporting this. So you have the votes you need, obviously, to get this through, but will you have to resort to forcing it through, time allocation, that sort of thing? I don't know where the block is necessarily on this, and you've accused the Conservatives of delaying the Senate bill. Any sense you can get cooperation on this government bill?
Well, I certainly hope so. The Conservatives have said time and time again, despite statements to the contrary, that they will not affect Canadians' rights. This is a particular instance in which Conservatives, in which Per Poilievre was a part, affected Canadians' rights and removed something that's most dear to them, like their citizenship. Hopefully they can demonstrate good faith and not do this again. Parliament, importantly, has these procedures of first, second, and third reading. And if they choose to go down that path, we may have to take extra measures to make sure this goes through. The Bloc Québécois, obviously, they have their views on being Canadian citizens, but they're very practical about that, and they think there are some people that would be residents of Quebec that are affected by this as well.
Okay, so in the meantime, as this works through Parliament, as you said, you have some discretion as minister to grant citizenship if the obvious cases that meet these criteria, come into the system prior to this being passed. But I wonder, Minister, if you can give us a sense of just how many people could be affected by this? Because, second generation born outside the country, I don't know if that's a massive number or a medium number. How many people do you think this could actually affect?
It's a really good question, David, and I think a really important one. The honest answer is we don't know. We have previous experience with amendments to the Citizenship Act where we thought there was a much larger pool than folks that actually presented themselves to assert Canadian citizenship. It isn't everyone that would have that right pursuant to the court case or other amendments to the law that necessarily present themselves to get that Canadian citizenship. They're perhaps well established in the countries that they're in, but we've certainly seen that as a matter of fairness, this is something that we have to do as a government. It is a right of these folks who have seen their right to be Canadian citizens unfairly denied, and that's something that we need to fix. We have a managed process in place, and we're very hopeful. I'm actually quite glad for those people that are trying to do that. You heard the people today in the press conference, but there are many more who have been waiting for years to see this happen, so this is a great day for them.
So under this, that first generation of Canadians that wants their citizenship passed on to that second generation of Canadians born abroad has to demonstrate the substantial connection test, which is 1,095 days spent cumulatively in Canada, basically 3 years prior to the birth of their child. How did you arrive at that standard, and what's the time frame over which those 3 years have to have happened? Is there a limit to when those dates could count?
So there isn't a limit over the time period people can assert their substantial connection of 3 years to Canada. This is something that comes essentially from the naturalization criteria that we have already in place. It is a reasonable test. Obviously, Canadian citizenship is not for everyone. Not everyone is entitled to it. Most people seeking permanent residency have to earn it, and that, I think, makes our Canadian citizenship and the pride that people have in becoming Canadians very important. So it isn't for everyone that has even a remote connection to Canada, but they have to demonstrate that substantial connection. We think that 3 years is a fair category, or a fair criteria to observe for people that want to assert it.
You were criticizing the Conservatives earlier for the changes they made that led to this, but some of the motivation that came from those changes was the so-called Canadians of convenience, as they've been called. And a lot of people point to the evacuation of Lebanon, where 15,000 Lebanese Canadians evacuated to Canada from Beirut during a war with Israel. What concerns, what kind of criteria do you have in place to guard against the so-called Canadian of convenience phenomena, or is that something you're overly concerned about as a government?
You know, David, there is concern. The concern here that was expressed by the Conservatives because they were upset that they had to foot the bill for people that were entitled to be Canadian, I think is a bit crass. I don't want to, at the same time, undermine the fact that there are folks that perhaps are not entitled to become Canadian citizens, but in the context of a war where you're just trying to save lives, it seems a bit odd to have use this as an excuse to introduce something that eventually turned out to be illegal and against the Charter. Again, the substantial connection to Canada and having to demonstrate that you've spent 3 years here, I think, is a reasonable one. And the court has certainly said that the cohort of people that applied to them and won the day in court are ones that should never have been discriminated in the first place. The court also noted that this was one that was disproportionately impacting women. So that's also important, and particularly this government, but it should be to all Canadians.
Okay, well, one last point to touch on, Minister. I mean, the woman, her name escapes me, who's there with you today, born in Boston, had kids there. That's an easy example that you can see how you would go through the process, justify your connection, and qualify. Things get a little bit more murky, I guess, with Indigenous people who live in Canada because borders are different. Some of their territorial lands go into the United States. How would this apply, with Indigenous population where life may exist on both sides of the Canada-U.S. border, but still be on their traditional lands?
Well, I would hasten to add, David, that woman in question was Mi'kmaq as well. It is complex, and I wouldn't also, by that same brushstroke, say that all those people consider themselves Canadian. This is a citizenship that has been imposed on them by virtue of law. Clearly, those people have mobility rights and the right to enter and exit Canada. That's something that I think we need to move on and facilitate. But should Indigenous communities want to come forward and assert their connection to Canada, that is certainly a test that would apply to them. I think there's an overarching question that you rightly point out, dealing with their mobility rights as enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that we have to deal with in an expedient fashion. It's something I'm looking at working on, perhaps in upcoming legislation as well, or using my ministerial authority to deal with this issue, which is one of basic mobility rights for Indigenous peoples.
Marc Miller, Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. Thank you for your time today, sir.
Thanks for having me on, David.